Welcome to another episode of Taking Control of Cancer, the podcast brought to you by the North East London Cancer Alliance. I'm Steve Bland, and in this podcast we try and give you a bit of a how-to guide to help you overcome common myths, fears, barriers to cancer prevention, diagnosis, treatment and care. It's called Taking Control of Cancer because we want to help you take control of cancer, and while we know that not all cancers are preventable, there are tangible things that we can all do to make a real positive difference to the health and well-being of our family, our friends and our colleagues. And whether you're a healthcare professional, whether you've got cancer yourself, maybe you know someone, a loved one's got cancer, there's something in there for everybody. And this episode is a really, really important one because it's all about end-of-life care and death. And it's something that we just don't talk about. And I'm really passionate about getting people talking about this topic. And I've got the perfect guest because Kathryn Mannix was a palliative care doctor for 30 years. She's written 2 amazing books, With the End in Mind and Listen. You'll have heard her. She's an amazing broadcaster, really incredible guest. And she's someone that helped me, particularly in the last days of my first wife, Rachel's death, some 6 or so years ago. So this is a really important one to me. I hope you take plenty from it too, because it's a really, really big topic that we're not very good at talking about. So here is Kathryn. So Kathryn, thank you so much for joining me on Taking Control of Cancer. I insisted that you were the only person that I wanted to speak to when it comes to talking about death and dying and lots of the things that we don't like talking about around this area. But I think it would just be helpful just to start with a bit of background about you. You know, what's your background professionally that's sort of led you to this point where you spend so much time campaigning and talking about these topics?
Sure, thanks, and thanks for inviting me. So I was a palliative care doctor, and I did that for 30 years. In fact, I started before it was even called palliative care in the mid-1980s. And by the time I changed direction to do this work, I'd been working as a consultant in a hospice and in a big, busy teaching hospital in the north of England for 20 years. And I was exasperated, really, by the lack of any change in public understanding and conversations about dying, as though every person and every family around that person was surprised that people die, and that includes us. So there was a particular family, a particular tipping point, which we could talk about later if there's time. But I just became more and more aware that we need to do something about public understanding of dying rather than just trying to fix it, each individual family, one at a time. And so that led me to take early retirement and think about what can I do, because I've seen dying up close and personal, thousands and thousands of times, to try and help people be better prepared and less terrified. And I wasn't quite sure what I would do, but there was an interesting series of unexpected events, shall we say, that led me to speaking on Radio 4 on 1-to-1. And then a publishing person, a literary agent, heard that interview and got in touch with me to say, I heard you telling a story on the radio. Have you got other stories? Have you ever thought about writing a book? And of course, I've got hundreds of stories.
Yeah.
And a book is the perfect way to put those stories out into the world. So that's how it started.
And you wrote the wonderful With the End in Mind. That's the book I presume that you're talking about there. But just go back to the Radio 4 thing, the BBC, because that's where I first became aware of you. I think, was it a video that you did for the BBC off the back of that?
Oh, yes. So the video was off the back of the book. Off the back of With the End in Mind, I got invited to the Free Thinking Festival that Radio 3 sponsor at the Music Centre in Gateshead. It used to be called the Sage. It's called the Glass House now. And when I got there was a team putting together a new site for BBC called BBC Ideas. And so they wanted to catch some of the ideas that were coming up at that festival. So we recorded, and the we is a producer, director, interviewer, camera woman, and her friend who is the lighting, sound, make it all work person. So there's three women in this great big music centre, but we needed to find a quiet place. So basically, we were in a cupboard. And every time they wheeled a musical instrument past outside, the rumbling of the cart or the jangling of the harp strings as these instruments went past, we had to stop. So it was dozens and dozens of takes, but they brought it together so beautifully. So they called it In My Humble Opinion. And their title for it is Dying Isn't As Bad As You Think, or something like that. Not the title I would have chosen, but it's just 3 minutes of what actually happens, how we can be a little bit less afraid and a little bit more prepared. And what I know has happened since then is, well, it introduced me to the You, Me, Big C podcast because Rachel wanted to discuss it with the other two girls on the podcast. And that, of course, led lots of other people to find it. But the other lovely thing that happens with it is that palliative care practitioners, end of life people, district nurses, GPs, they play it on their phones for patients and families to help them to understand more and be less afraid. And that's just what a fantastic thing that is, to think that that mad, half hour in a cupboard has led to something that's been so useful for so many people.
Well, I'm one of those people, and before we get on to your kind of broader work and the whys and the the wherefores, I was one of those people. Obviously, I became aware of you because you did a piece with the girls on the podcast before I started doing it, but I was obviously aware of it, and then and then when in the last probably week or so of Rachel's death, I can remember very clearly watching it again because I was starting to see some of the things that you talked about. And one thing particularly, just to pick out one example, you talked about the death rattle that people are generally quite afraid of as being, well, see it as something kind of quite scary. But you explained it in that video as being actually a sign that they're very much at peace and their body's very calm actually, and that understanding. We spoke in the last few days of Rachel's life, via message, Instagram message, and text message, and a lot of the things that you said in that video, a lot of the things that you were telling me, I was seeing, and I made that whole experience, while awful, so much more manageable and less terrifying. And I think there are so many misconceptions, aren't there, about the actual physical process of dying. And I wonder if is that maybe a mixture of what we see on TV? Is it just the fact that we don't want to talk about it? Where does some of those things come from?
Yeah, you're right. It's a really complicated recipe, isn't it? So partly it's because we don't see it anymore. Whereas 100 years ago, when people were so sick that they might be dying, there wasn't any point in going into hospital because hospital didn't have anything to help. So people stayed at home and their family and friends rallied round, and everybody had seen dying enough times to recognise the patterns, to just be familiar with what's going on, and to understand the kind of phases and stages of dying. So, they would know when to send for the priest or the rabbi or whoever for that particular person. And they would know when to send for the family who lived, a few hours away. They'd know when to send for the family who lived a few days' travel away. People understood it. So we've lost contact with it because people who are sick enough to die now go to hospital in case we can save their lives. And sometimes, of course, we can. So that's not a bad thing, but it's the kind of flip side of the good medical developments.
Yeah.
But then not knowing what normally happens, but not knowing that you don't know, leaves a space in your head, which the Hollywood death and the soap opera death and the difficult deaths, because there are sometimes difficult deaths. It's usually not difficult, but the bad experiences get into the newspapers and the good experiences don't. So if there's a space, it just gets filled up with all of that unreliable, not typical information. And now we don't know what to expect. We don't like not knowing what to expect. And we're frightened. And I think once things start to happen in front of us when we already feel afraid, we interpret those things in a much more scary way than we would, like you did when you were watching what was happening, understanding what was happening. It didn't make it happier for you, but it made it clearer to you because you were able to interpret exactly what was happening. So you didn't need to add traumatic misinterpretations to the sadness that you were feeling as you were there alongside Rachel.
That was exactly it. Like I sort of felt like at every stage I knew what I should do, whether it was to call someone or if there's something I could deal with because it was entirely normal. Whereas I think if I hadn't have watched the video, hadn't have spoken to you, there probably would have been some things in that last few days that would have really terrified me, that I'd have been really panicking about, and probably ringing everybody I knew to try and get some guidance on what to do. I think it's a lot of it comes down to the fact that we don't want to talk about it, doesn't it? So you talk about this gap in knowledge, this hole that is filled by things like Hollywood deaths, but we just don't want to engage with death, do we? We don't want to talk about it. Rachel used to find this when she would. I remember having a conversation with her mum, and her mum was kind of couching the language a little bit, fudging it, and Rachel just said, "Mum, I'm going to die. We need to talk about it properly." And her mum just didn't want to talk about it, and I can completely understand that as a parent. It would be absolutely heartbreaking, and it's not a criticism of Rachel's mum at all. But we don't want to talk about it, do we? And the things we don't want to talk about all of a sudden become so much more terrifying than perhaps they would be if we spoke about them.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that a really good demonstration of that journey from I can't even bear to talk about it to, right, okay, we need some plans here, is Deb. So
Yeah.
when I first met the Yumi Big C podcasters, in fact, when I first heard the episode, the death episode, which I think was the first episode of series 2, wasn't it?
Yeah, it
They
was. Yeah.
interviewed Greg Wise,
Yeah.
and they played the audio track of that BBC Ideas video.
Yeah.
What they weren't expecting, I think, was that Greg and I already knew each other from our End of Life Conversations campaigning. And I think he probably then made the introductions. So I came up and met the team later in Salford. So in that first episode, there was a kind of spectrum from Rachel at one end saying, this is real, this is happening. I know now that it's beginning to happen to me. I've got to get ready. The people I love have to be ready. I need to know what to expect. Lauren saying, God, this is horrible. I really wish we didn't have to talk about it, but I understand that we do, and we need to be more curious about it. And Deb saying, I can't bear it. I just can't bear even to hear you saying it. I can't say the words. And what was really powerful about that was between the three of them, they represented every type of opinion and position in their listening audience. So after that, whenever I spoke to Deb, she would give herself marks out of 10 for how ready she was to be able to talk about it. So she said, so that very first episode, I wasn't even at 0. I was in negative numbers. I just really hated it. I just couldn't do it. By the time I came up to talk to you guys in Salford, which was probably about 18 months later,
Yeah, probably.
she said, I'm probably 2 or 3 out of 10. After that, on a variety of occasions, we would either be talking to each other or be messaging back channel. She gradually crept up towards, I think 6 was the highest she felt she'd got to. But by the time she was dying, she clearly had done her planning. She knew that she wanted not to be in her own home, so she went to her mum and dad's. She put all sorts of plans in place. Well, you can't put plans in place if you haven't done any thinking about it or any talking about it. So it was clear that she and her husband had got to the place where, difficult though it was, they were able to put their plans in place. And she even put something out on social media about, I know that it's coming soon. I'm choosing most of the time not to think about it, but I know it's going to be all right when it's happening. And I
Yeah.
just thought, well, God bless you, Debs, because that's been a real journey for you.
Yeah.
And that it's, it's not brave to not feel fear, is it? It's
Yeah.
brave to feel the fear and to face up to it and to do
Yeah.
the thing that you're frightened of.
Yeah. That's what I always used to think about a wonderful Dame Deborah, Rachel and Lauren, that they used to do themselves quite a disservice when they talked about ignorance. Actually, they knew exactly what was going on, but they chose to talk about it anyway. And I think so much of probably the nation's understanding of cancer and death actually comes from Deb. I think she became such a beacon of sort of not just hope but information. I think by the end.
Yeah, yeah, she absolutely did. So the week that Deb was dying, which was really hard, wasn't it? And it was really hard for you guys who knew and loved her so well. And I only knew her vaguely, but it was it was sad to be watching and listening. Anyway, thanks to Deb, the BBC was interested in what was happening. So I described dying to the nation twice over their breakfast that week on Radio 5 live on one of the days, and then on BBC Breakfast from this room where we are now. They wanted me on the sofa and I couldn't get there in
Yeah,
time. It's just not
yeah,
handy, is it? So Deb's dying in public like that, even though she was able to do it very privately at her mum and dad's house, but her talking about it so publicly was a massive act of public service. I'm so grateful to her.
yeah, yeah. It really was, and I think a lot of this is obviously to the public attitude to death. But I'd like to ask you a little bit about your experience in actually working in hospitals and working in healthcare, because I don't know if everybody working in those environments is very good at it either. And I think there's quite a bit of work. We talk about cancer pathways, and there's a lot of work going into making sure that holistic needs assessments and all these different things going on. And I wonder if you think there's enough going on in hospitals and in the way that patients are treated and looked after to prepare them for what might happen at the end.
Yeah, well, I think we all know that there isn't. And I think that probably there's a variety of reasons for that. So I guess the first thing that I should probably say, mainly so that the palliative care community don't kill me, is that palliative care is not about dying. That
Yeah,
palliative care is relevant at any stage of your illness. And certainly my team in the hospital where I worked, we used to meet people post-operatively after they'd had massive esophageal cancer surgery, which involves um, both a chest wound and a belly wound for the surgeons to get in there and do what they have to do. And they're doing that to cure people, right? But we know that the cure rates are highest the sooner the person gets better from their surgery so they can get on to radiotherapy, chemotherapy, whatever is going to happen next. So we were part of their post-op care team because palliative care has expertise in managing symptoms, the pain, the nausea of, having surgeons fiddling about with your intestines in that way, joining things together that never were intended to be joined together. And our work there in helping people to be better sooner after their surgery is palliative care. It's quality of life. That's what we're entirely about. And those people go on to be cured. That's not about end of life care. But usually, the best way to stop somebody's symptoms from their illness is to cure their illness. And that's why palliative care very often meets people whose illness can't be cured. Very often it can be controlled for a long time. And we're there to add the kind of quality to a service where the oncologists are reaching for quantity all the time, aren't they? They're trying to extend the length of life. And we should be part of that team that's saying, okay, so you're having this treatment and the treatment itself has toxicities. How can we help you to bear the treatment? Or, while you're having the treatment, what's happening to your sleep or your appetite or your mobility or whatever it is, so that we're all working together around this person and the people who matter most to them to keep them the wellest we can keep them. But it also means we're often still attached to people and working alongside those people when they reach the very end phase of their illness. And so we get very experienced in being part of end of life care. But being referred to the palliative care team does not mean you're starting end of life care. So I need to say that very clearly at the beginning.
100%.
You're not obliged to die if you see the palliative care team. It's okay.
Yeah.
But we do see a lot of dying. We do see a lot of end of life care, and it gives us some kind of wisdom to give to other people. And I think that one of the things that happens in hospital is that the team that's primarily looking after a patient, so for people who are listening who are people managing their cancers, then that's largely oncology and surgery teams. But there are lots of other long-term conditions that people might eventually die from, but they're living with at the moment, heart diseases and lung diseases and things like that. Very often, because the patients tend to think that palliative care means end of life care, or even mistakenly, the doctors and nurses of the team that's looking after the person think that palliative care is the same as end of life care. They keep saying, oh, well, we won't refer to the palliative care team yet because it's too soon. So it's never too soon for palliative care. It is never too soon. If the person has a symptom that your team can't deal with, our team will help you. And we can dip in and out. We don't have to take over. We can just add a little bit. So if you're a person who's listening and you've got a symptom or a trouble or an anxiety, or somebody's responding in your family circle in a way that shows they're having a lot of difficulty, if the team around you that you've already got, which has huge expertise, if they haven't got the solution for this particular problem, we can come in and extend the expertise of their team. We add our palliative care expertise in pain and nausea and breathlessness and bowels and mobility and all sorts of different things, but also emotional well-being and worry and sadness and anger and teenagers not knowing how to deal with things. All of that, we're there for you to help to support that part of what's difficult at the moment. And we might meet you once, we might see you every so often for a period of time, we might walk alongside you for months or years. What we'll do is what works and is needed for you. There isn't a kind of one size fits all. So if you're not comfortable, if you're not sorted, if there are things that are still feel like they're hanging off the edge a bit, get the palliative care team involved and don't let anybody tell you that it's too soon.
Do you think we need to lose the word palliative? Because I think however many times we say these things, patients hear the word palliative and they do just jump to end of life care. I'm starting in my end of life care, even though, like you say, I know people that were on palliative care for 10, 11, 12 years, or people that weren't even dying in any way who were supported by palliative care teams. So do you think we need to lose the word palliative and think of something else that maybe doesn't strike the same fear into people?
It's hard to know. We have this conversation a lot in our specialty. The difficulty is that if we called ourselves the banana team, then in 6 months' time, people would be going, oh, the banana team, they see dying people, don't they?
Yeah.
So I think what actually needs to happen is the other way round, that the rest of medicine's got to get over itself and start to refer to palliative care at diagnosis.
Yeah.
And let us weave in and out where we can add value. We will. When we're not needed, we back off. There's not enough of us to do everything for everybody, and there are plenty of people doing an excellent service. But if palliative care stopped being a service that opted in when times are particularly difficult, and instead was just part of the service that flexes in and out as it's needed, I think we could change the reputation without changing the name. Interestingly, at your local cancer hospital at the Christie, the palliative care team that works within the Christie Hospital calls itself the supportive care team. And that's partly because it being a cancer-specific hospital, that palliative care team has particular expertise at a lot of the side effects and difficulties that come with the complicated cancer treatments that people are having. So they've got an extra layer of palliative care expertise that's very specific to those cancer services. And so they're calling themselves a supportive care team, kind to let people know that they're palliative care plus, they've got these kind of extra expertise as well. So it's going to be interesting to see whether that changes the acceptability of the team. But I suspect that it will change the acceptability of the team because they're co-working from diagnosis.
Yeah, that's
It's the
such a good point,
reputation
isn't it?
change. Yeah.
That's such a good point. If it was part of the journey from day one, and it wasn't just, oh, we've exhausted everything else, so we'll have to get the palliative care team in. Yeah, it absolutely would. It would change attitudes pretty quickly, I think, wouldn't it? And I
Yeah, I
think
think it
it's,
would.
that's, it may be part of, what I was going to ask next. I know, I don't want to get political, but we've got a new government, and I know Cancer Research UK, for example, have been very vocal in talking about the need for a national action plan on cancer. We need more activity around reducing waiting times, reducing times of people to get into the system, and all that kind of thing. What I haven't heard in terms of a national action plan is what we do about what we're talking about here, what we do about dying and an end of life and that kind of thing. And I wonder if you think there needs to be a bit more of a plan nationally, so we aren't just relying on one hospital saying we're going to change the name, we're going to change the way it works. If it needs to be a kind of wider plan to tackle misconceptions or the way we deal with dying.
Yeah, I think that it so much needs to be reconsidered from grassroots, because the country, whoever is the government, has a 100% death rate. And since every single person in the country is going to die at some point of something, we could do with getting a lot better at thinking about what are the things that are most important during living, because people who die during a particular day, but they're doing living until they get to that point, aren't they? So, I mean, you and I have talked about this before. Anybody who's having a baby starts planning how they're going to deal with pregnancy and labour and birth and the early period when you first have had your baby and you don't know which way is up, especially when it's your first baby. Um, you start that planning from the minute you get a positive pregnancy test. It's a thing that's recognised, that you don't go into your labour not knowing anything about labour. And you don't go through a good, healthy pregnancy that's really putting the care of the pregnant person and the growing baby or babies without planning that, without understanding about how to get the right amount of rest, eat the right amount of food, um, plan yourself forward into your labour, know where you'd like to be, who your companions will be, who'll look after the other children you might have while you're in labour, who's going to be your birth partner, um, how much up for trial of labour versus really preferring a caesarean from the outset are you? All of that planned in maximum detail. And that's normal to have a birth plan. And what happens is that the midwives look at our birth plans and manage to keep a straight face, because they can see which bits are just probably not going to happen and which
Yeah.
bits are just, the minute we start actually having contractions, we're not going to even worry about that thing anymore, because they've seen it hundreds and hundreds of times. But when they're with a woman who is in labour, they're with that individual. And even though they've seen birth hundreds, thousands of times, they know the process is the same from one pregnancy to the next, but it's this person, it's these babies, and it has to be managed as it happens in the best possible way. And we should be doing the same for dying. Dying also has phases and stages, and it's not at all unlike labour. And we can prepare for it, we can talk about it, but we just don't.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, how many people do you think, if at the point of diagnosis, or even before diagnosis, even before there's any health issue on the radar, if we were kind of told to start thinking about a death plan, that how do we want it to look, and how do we want it to feel, and how do we want it to to all play out, how many people do you think really would engage with that? And I think it then comes back to the fact that we really don't like talking about it. Do you think we are getting better, though, in that respect, as a talking very broadly about the country? Do you think we are getting better at talking about death? Because I mean, for me, I feel there's a whole Instagram community now that's built up that I think back to when Rachel was diagnosed, when I first kind of got into the cancer world. It just wasn't there. People didn't talk about it, and now you have this huge community talking about all different aspects of their cancer journey. And I wonder if you think we are getting better at talking about these things.
I think there are communities that are, and I think that some of the communities on social media are incredibly supportive to each other, aren't they? People who can't engage their own families in conversation can engage with these strangers on the internet to talk about what they're worried about or to get extra information. And I get messages from people through my social media all the time asking me about how to talk to their children, or this is what I saw when my mum was dying, what did it mean? So it's clear that people want to know, but that doesn't translate, we see, into actually having a plan that your doctors know about, for
Yeah.
example, or going along to your GP and saying, okay, I've been thinking about it now with my family for a while, I got my ideas in order. Can I let you know what I hope the plan is so that you can help me to make sure that's the way it goes? That is still not happening.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, there's so much advice on this in your wonderful books. You mentioned one earlier, I think, with the end in mind. The other one, Listen. Um, were you when you wrote, going back to the book, actually, when you wrote with the end in mind, were you surprised at all with how kind of well received a book about about death about death was? Because for some people it is a tough subject, as we've just said, isn't it? And I wonder, yeah, do you think it surprised you with how well received it was?
Steve, I still can't quite believe that what has happened has happened. So yeah, I think I thought I'd be able to write something sensible in proper sentences with good punctuation, and it would be in some libraries, and then at least I would feel that I had put that into the world. The idea that it would become a bestseller, that it would be shortlisted for a prize, that it's in 16. I've just got my 17th translation contract for
Wow.
it now. That's just like absolutely mind blowing.
Yeah.
But what it shows us is that it's not just Britain that doesn't know. And I get
Yeah.
messages and letters from people all over the world. Thank goodness for Google Translate sometimes, because and it's the same concerns. I don't know what to expect. I don't know how to talk to people about it. Is it all right to ask my doctor to give me advice about this, from people who are getting themselves and getting other people ready? And then the really, really sad messages from people who have watched somebody die, not understood the process, heard the bizarre breathing that people who are deeply unconscious do, which sounds very weird and is really easy to misinterpret as struggle and drowning and choking and groaning. And it's not any of that. It's the breathing of somebody who's so deeply unconscious that they can't feel their throat anymore. Exactly that thing that you were talking about earlier with the death rattle. So to be able to give people that, it's not even reassurance. I'm not setting out to reassure people. I'm setting out to inform people, because I think
Yeah.
that when you know, then you reassure yourself, which is much more powerful than needing to go to somebody else to ask if this is okay. If you're ready and you're watching it, you go, oh, yeah, that's that weird breathing that I heard that woman talk about, or I read about in that book. And so I've had feedback like that from people saying, I one lady said, my sister and I we'd been with our mum for days, and we were just exhausted and a bit grubby, and we really needed to change her clothes. And the nurse said, look, she looks really comfortable and peaceful. Why don't you guys go home for the night, have a shower, try and get some sleep, and come back tomorrow in comfortable clothes and bring your slippers. This nurse was really kind. And my sister said, yeah, that's really nice. We'll go to my house because that's closest. Come on, let's go. And as we were leaving the room, I noticed my mum's breathing was different. And I said to my sister, we mustn't go now. We have to stay now. Look at her breathing. This is the breathing change that woman talks about in her video. And she said, if we'd left the hospital, we wouldn't have even got halfway to my sister's house before my mum had died.
Right, wow.
And that nurse hadn't seen it, which brings us back to that other thing you said before. We've grown up in a society that hasn't seen lots of dying, and nobody teaches us about dying at medical school and nursing school. They teach us how to stop people from dying, but we're not yet taught how, when dying can't be stopped, it can be supported and comforted, and people can be given information and have the process described to them so they understand it and don't come away traumatized by it. So it's giving people information allows them then to feel less afraid, more in charge, and better prepared.
That's the point, isn't it? Information, because I think it's never going to be anything less than heartbreaking when somebody dies, and it's just having that information takes away levels of anxiety about what you're seeing and what you should do, and how you should be responding to it. And it's amazing. And I think I need to say thank you to you from myself, but also from people in 17 countries around the world for what you're doing, because it is amazingly important work that you're doing to take away the stigma, take away the fear about something that we don't know about, and we are terrified about. So yeah, thank you for that, and thank you so much for speaking to me today, Kathryn. It's been great.
Steve, thanks so much.